The 19th century went from horse-drawn carriages to electric light bulbs in just 100 years. And what happened in between is absolutely insane. The 19th century. 10 mind-blowing facts about the century that went from horse-drawn carriages to electric light bulbs. Imagine being born in a world where the fastest you could travel was on horseback and dying in a world where you could talk to someone on the other side of the planet instantly. That's exactly what happened to people living through the most mind-bending century in human history. 1801 kicked off a century so packed with world-changing innovations that it makes our modern technological progress look like we're moving in slow motion. This wasn't just gradual improvement. This was humanity having a complete technological nervous breakdown while accidentally creating the modern world. But here's what makes the 19th century absolutely terrifying. Every single innovation that made life better also made life more dangerous. The same trains that connected continents also enabled industrial warfare. The same factories that created prosperity also created pollution. The same communications that united families also enabled global propaganda. Progress and catastrophe were happening simultaneously. Fact number 1. Napoleon almost conquered the entire world. Before breakfast, Napoleon Bonaparte looked at the map of Europe and decided that having multiple countries was inefficient. Between 1804 and 1814, he conquered most of continental Europe, crowned himself emperor, and came terrifyingly close to creating a unified European superstate 2 centuries before the European Union. The scale of Napoleonic conquest was absolutely unprecedented. French armies marched from Spain to Russia, from Italy to Germany, defeating every major European power except Britain. Napoleon didn't just win battles. He redesigned entire political systems, legal codes, and administrative structures that are still used today. The Napoleonic Code became the legal foundation for dozens of countries. French administrative systems replaced feudal chaos with rational bureaucracy. French educational reforms created merit-based advancement that destroyed aristocratic privileges. Napoleon was accidentally creating modern government while trying to conquer the world. But Napoleonic expansion also created modern nationalism. Germans discovered they were German when French armies occupied their territories. Spanish guerrilla warfare proved that popular resistance could defeat professional armies. Russian winter campaigns showed that even the greatest military genius couldn't conquer geography and climate. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 ended Napoleon's career. But Napoleonic ideas continued reshaping Europe for decades. Every major political revolution, nationalist movement, and democratic reform of the 19th century traced back to changes that Napoleon had implemented during his brief European empire. Most remarkably, Napoleon proved that one individual could still change the course of world history through personal ambition and military genius. The 19th century began with the last great conqueror in European history. Fact number 2. The Industrial Revolution turned humans into machine operators. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about steam engines and factories. It was about fundamentally changing what it meant to be human. For thousands of years, people had worked with their hands, controlled their own schedules, and lived in communities where everyone knew everyone else. Suddenly, millions of people were operating machines, following factory schedules, and living in cities where they were surrounded by strangers. The transformation was brutal and rapid. English textile workers, who had spent generations mastering hand-weaving skills, discovered that steam-powered machines could produce more cloth in a day than they could make in a month. Traditional craftsmen became obsolete overnight. Rural communities that had existed for centuries were abandoned as people moved to industrial cities. Factory conditions were horrific by modern standards. Workers operated dangerous machinery for 12 to 16 hours per day, 6 days per week. Child labor was common because small fingers could operate textile machinery more efficiently than adult hands. Industrial accidents killed or maimed workers regularly, and there were no safety regulations or compensation systems. But industrial wages, despite being low, were often higher than agricultural wages. Factory workers could afford manufactured goods that had previously been luxury items. Urban workers had access to entertainment, education, and social opportunities that rural workers couldn't imagine. The Industrial Revolution was simultaneously liberating and enslaving the working class. The psychological impact was enormous. People who had lived their entire lives in rural communities where change happened slowly found themselves in urban environments where everything changed constantly. Traditional social relationships based on family, community, and religious authority were replaced by economic relationships based on wages, contracts, and market forces. Industrial capitalism created wealth on a scale that had never existed before, but it also created poverty, pollution, and social instability that nobody knew how to address. The Industrial Revolution proved that technological progress could improve living standards while destroying traditional ways of life. Fact number 3, the telegraph made distance irrelevant. Before the telegraph, information could only travel as fast as a human being could carry it. A message from New York to London took weeks to deliver by ship. A message from London to India took months to deliver by land and sea. The telegraph changed everything by making instant communication possible across any distance. The first successful telegraph message was sent in 1844, and within 30 years, telegraph cables connected every continent except Antarctica. Suddenly, business decisions made in London could be implemented in India the same day. News from America could reach Europe in hours rather than weeks. Financial markets became globally connected in real time. The economic impact was revolutionary. Merchants could coordinate international trade with unprecedented efficiency. Shipping companies could track cargo and adjust routes based on current conditions. Banks could transfer money across continents instantly. The telegraph created the first truly global economy. But the telegraph also transformed warfare, diplomacy, and journalism. Military commanders could coordinate operations across vast distances. Diplomatic negotiations could happen in real time between countries thousands of miles apart. Newspaper reporters could file stories from remote locations and have them published the same day. The psychological impact was equally profound. People began to think of the world as a smaller, more connected place. Distance became less important than speed of communication. The telegraph created the expectation that information should be available instantly, regardless of where it originated. Telegraph networks also created new forms of social control. Governments could coordinate administrative activities across their territories more efficiently. Police forces could share information about criminals instantly. The telegraph made centralized authority more powerful and more responsive than ever before. Fact number 4. Darwin proved humans weren't special. Charles Darwin spent 5 years sailing around the world on the HMS Beagle, collecting specimens and making observations that would fundamentally change how humans understood their place in the natural world. When he published On the Origin of Species in 1859, he didn't just propose a new scientific theory. He destroyed the comfortable belief that humans were divinely created and fundamentally different from other animals. Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection suggested that humans had evolved from other species through the same processes that shaped all life on Earth. There was no divine plan, no special creation, no fundamental difference between humans and other animals. We were just another species that had happened to develop intelligence and opposable thumbs. The religious implications were devastating. If humans had evolved naturally, then the biblical account of creation was wrong. If natural selection explained human development, then divine intervention wasn't necessary. If humans were just animals, then what made human life sacred or human morality meaningful? Scientific resistance was equally intense. The scientific establishment had spent centuries developing theories based on the assumption that species were permanently fixed and divinely created. Darwin's theory required rethinking every aspect of biology, geology, and anthropology. Many scientists rejected evolutionary theory, not because the evidence was weak, but because the implications were too disturbing. Social implications were equally controversial. If humans had evolved through competition and natural selection, then maybe social inequality was natural and inevitable. Some people interpreted Darwin's theory as justification for racism, imperialism, and economic exploitation. Others argued that evolutionary theory proved that cooperation and mutual aid were also natural human behaviors. Darwin had accidentally created the intellectual foundation for both scientific materialism and social Darwinism. His theory explained how complex life could develop without divine intervention, but it also suggested that human society might be governed by the same competitive forces that shaped natural selection. Fact number 5. The American Civil War became the first modern war. The American Civil War wasn't just a conflict between North and South. It was the first war fought with industrial technology, and the results were horrifying. Between 1861 and 1865, Americans discovered that rifles, railroads, and telegraph communications could make warfare more deadly and destructive than anyone had imagined possible. Traditional military tactics assumed that soldiers would fight with muskets that were inaccurate beyond 50 yards and took 30 seconds to reload. Civil War soldiers fought with rifles that were accurate at 300 yards and could be loaded in 15 seconds. Cavalry charges and infantry formations that had worked for centuries became suicide missions. The casualty numbers were staggering. The Battle of Gettysburg killed or wounded over 50,000 soldiers in 3 days. The Battle of Antietam killed or wounded over 23,000 soldiers in a single day. Total Civil War deaths exceeded 600,000, making it the deadliest conflict in American history. But the Civil War also demonstrated the power of industrial logistics. Northern factories could produce weapons, ammunition, and supplies faster than Confederate forces could destroy them. Northern railroads could transport troops and equipment more efficiently than Confederate armies could move on foot. Northern telegraph networks could coordinate military operations more effectively than Confederate messengers on horseback. The war's impact on civilian populations was equally revolutionary. Sherman's march to the sea proved that industrial warfare could destroy entire regions' economic infrastructure. Photography brought images of battlefield carnage into American homes for the first time. Newspaper reporting made distant battles feel immediate and personal. Civil War innovations in medical care, military engineering, and battlefield communications would influence military development for decades. The Civil War had accidentally created the template for total war that would define 20th century conflicts. Fact number 6. The Suez Canal made Europe master of the world. The The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, was more than just an impressive engineering project. It was the key that gave European powers control over global trade routes and made European imperialism practically unstoppable. By connecting the Mediterranean and Red Seas, the canal reduced the sailing distance between Europe and Asia by over 4,000 miles. Before the Suez Canal, ships traveling from Europe to Asia had to sail around the entire African continent, a journey that took months and was extremely dangerous. The canal reduced this journey to weeks and made it much safer. Suddenly, European powers could project military force and commercial influence into Asia with unprecedented speed and efficiency. British control of the Suez Canal gave Britain effective control over trade between Europe and Asia. British naval forces could block the canal and cut off European rivals from Asian markets. British merchants could reach Asian ports faster than competitors from other countries. The canal made Britain the dominant global power for the rest of the 19th century. The economic impact was revolutionary. Asian goods became cheaper and more available in European markets. European manufactured goods could compete more effectively in Asian markets. Global trade volumes increased dramatically as shipping costs decreased and shipping times shortened. But the canal also intensified European imperial competition. French, German, and Russian powers couldn't allow Britain to control the most important trade route in the world. Imperial rivalry in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East became more intense as European powers competed for strategic positions along Asian trade routes. The Suez Canal proved that control over transportation infrastructure could be more valuable than control over territory. European powers began focusing on securing strategic ports, railway lines, and naval bases that could influence global commerce. Fact number 7. Germany unified and immediately became Europe's biggest problem. For centuries, Germany had been a collection of hundreds of small states, kingdoms, and principalities that couldn't agree on anything. Otto von Bismarck looked at this political chaos and decided that Germany needed to become a single, unified nation capable of competing with Britain, France, and Russia. What he accomplished between 1864 and 1871 was the most successful example of nation-building in European history. Bismarck's strategy was brilliantly simple: unite Germany through a series of short, victorious wars that would demonstrate German military superiority and create German national pride. The 7 Weeks' War against Austria proved that German forces could defeat the traditional German leader. The Franco-Prussian War against France proved that German forces could defeat the dominant European military power. German unification created the most powerful country in Europe almost overnight. The new German Empire had the largest population, the most advanced industrial economy, and the most effective military organization in continental Europe. German universities were producing the world's best scientists and engineers. German factories were competing successfully with British manufacturers. But German power also terrified Germany's neighbors. France wanted revenge for military defeat and territorial losses. Russia worried about German expansion toward Eastern Europe. Britain realized that German naval development could challenge British control of the seas. German unification had accidentally created the alliance system that would lead to World War I. German culture became increasingly militaristic and nationalist. German philosophers developed theories about German racial superiority and German historical destiny. German politicians talked about Germany's need for living space and world influence. German unification had created a nation that was too powerful for European stability, but not powerful enough for global dominance. Bismarck understood these dangers and tried to maintain European balance through diplomatic complexity. But his successors abandoned diplomatic restraint and pursued aggressive policies that would make German power a threat to world peace. Fact number 8. The scramble for Africa proved Europeans had completely lost their minds. Between 1880 and 1900, European powers divided up the entire African continent like they were splitting up a pizza. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, European politicians drew lines on maps and created countries in regions they had never visited, inhabited by people they had never met, using geographical knowledge that was often completely wrong. The speed of African colonization was absolutely insane. In 1880, Europeans controlled roughly 10% of African territory. By 1900, Europeans controlled roughly 90% of African territory. Entire civilizations that had existed for centuries were conquered, divided, and reorganized according to European administrative convenience. European justifications for African colonization were a mixture of racism, economic opportunism, and strategic competition. Europeans convinced themselves that Africans were racially inferior and needed European guidance to achieve civilization. European merchants wanted access to African markets and raw materials. European governments worried that rival European powers would gain strategic advantages through African territories. The technological advantages that made African colonization possible were overwhelming. European firearms were far superior to African weapons. European medical knowledge provided some protection against tropical diseases that had previously killed European explorers. European transportation technology, railroads, steamships, and telegraph networks enabled Europeans to coordinate colonial administration across vast distances. But African resistance was often fierce and prolonged. The Zulu Wars, the Mahdist War in Sudan, and the Anglo-Boer Wars proved that African forces could inflict serious casualties on European armies. European colonial conquest was successful, but expensive and frequently brutal. The long-term consequences were catastrophic. European colonial boundaries divided ethnic groups, combined hostile tribes, and created artificial nations that had no basis in African political traditions. European economic policies disrupted traditional African economies and created dependency relationships that would persist long after independence. Fact number 9. The Second Industrial Revolution made electricity and steel cheap. Just when people thought they understood industrial technology, the Second Industrial Revolution completely changed the rules again. Between 1870 and 1900, innovations in steel production, electrical generation, and chemical manufacturing created new industries that made the first industrial revolution look primitive. The Bessemer process made steel production so cheap and efficient that steel replaced iron in construction, transportation, and manufacturing. Suddenly, builders could construct skyscrapers, engineers could design longer bridges, and manufacturers could produce more durable machinery. Steel production became the measure of national industrial power. Electrical generation transformed both industrial production and domestic life. Electric motors were more efficient than steam engines and could be used in smaller manufacturing operations. Electric lighting made factories safer and more productive. Electric streetcars and subways revolutionized urban transportation. Electric communication systems made telephone and telegraph networks more reliable. Chemical industries created new materials and processes that hadn't existed before. Synthetic dyes made colored textiles cheaper and more diverse. Industrial explosives made mining and construction more efficient. Chemical fertilizers increased agricultural productivity. Chemical processing created new products that improved living standards. But the Second Industrial Revolution also created new forms of inequality and environmental destruction. Industrial workers faced new health hazards from chemical exposure and electrical accidents. Urban air quality deteriorated as coal-burning power plants and steel mills increased production. Industrial waste began polluting rivers and groundwater. The pace of technological change accelerated dramatically. People who had spent decades mastering first industrial revolution technology discovered that their skills were obsolete again. Traditional crafts and local industries couldn't compete with mass production using new materials and power sources. Fact number 10. The 19th century ended with everyone expecting permanent peace and progress. By 1900, educated people throughout Europe and America were convinced that humanity had finally figured out how to create permanent peace and continuous progress. International trade was making war economically irrational. Democratic governments were making political conflicts easier to resolve peacefully. Scientific knowledge was making human problems solvable through rational analysis. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The 19th century had seen unprecedented technological advancement, economic growth, and social improvement. Literacy rates were rising, living standards were improving, and international cooperation was increasing. Wars between major powers were becoming less frequent and less destructive. International organizations were developing mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution. The International Telegraph Union, the Universal Postal Union, and the International Red Cross proved that countries could cooperate on practical problems. International law was becoming more sophisticated and more widely accepted. Social reforms were addressing the worst problems of industrial capitalism. Labor unions were improving working conditions. Democratic movements were expanding political participation. Educational systems were creating more knowledgeable and rational citizens. Social problems that had seemed permanent were being solved through organized effort. Scientific progress was accelerating at an unprecedented rate. Medical advances were reducing infant mortality and extending life expectancy. Agricultural improvements were reducing the threat of famine. Transportation and communication technologies were connecting the world more closely than ever before. The optimism was sincere and rational, based on available evidence. People living in 1900 had experienced a century of remarkable progress and had every reason to believe that progress would continue. They couldn't imagine that the same technologies and social forces that had created prosperity and peace could also create unprecedented destruction and warfare. The 19th century had accidentally created the conditions for both 20th century progress and 20th century catastrophe. But people living in 1900 only saw the progress. Here's where the 19th century becomes absolutely mind-bending. Every single development that made life better also created the tools for making life worse. Industrial technology that created prosperity also created the weapons that would make World War I possible. Democratic movements that expanded political participation also created mass movements that could be manipulated by demagogues. Scientific knowledge that solved medical problems also created chemical weapons. Global communications that connected families also enabled international propaganda. The 19th century wasn't just about progress. It was about creating double-edged technologies that could be used for construction or destruction, depending on who controlled them. People living through this century thought they were building a better world, but they were actually building a more powerful world that could be better or worse, depending on how that power was used. The 19th century proved something terrifying about human nature. We're incredibly good at solving technical problems, but terrible at predicting the social consequences of our technical solutions. Every major innovation of the 19th century created new problems that nobody had anticipated. Progress and catastrophe weren't opposites. They were two sides of the same technological coin. This century revealed that human societies could change faster than human wisdom could develop. We could invent telegraphs before we understood how instant communication would affect human psychology. We could build factories before we understood how industrial labor would affect human communities. We could create global trade networks before we understood how economic interdependence would affect political stability. And that's how the 19th century went from horse-drawn carriages to electric light bulbs, while accidentally creating both the modern world and modern problems. Every convenience we take for granted, every global challenge we face, and every technological dilemma we struggle with can be traced back to innovations that 19th century people thought were obviously beneficial. If this deep dive into the century that changed everything blew your mind, smash that like button and subscribe for more explorations of history's most transformative periods. Let me know in the comments which of these facts shocked you most. And don't forget to check out our video on the 20th century, where all these 19th century innovations finally exploded into global warfare. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.